Look, I need to tell you something important. You're holding a Nobel Prize medal in your hand right now. Well, not you specifically, but imagine you are. It's gold. It's prestigious. It represents the highest honor in science. And Richard Feynman, one of the greatest physicists who ever lived, almost threw his in the trash. Not because he didn't deserve it, not because the science was wrong, but because he saw something about prizes, about recognition, about the whole system of scientific fame that made him physically sick. And when you hear what he actually said, in his own words, you're going to question everything you thought you knew about how science really works. This isn't about conspiracy theories. This isn't speculation. These are Feynman's actual thoughts, pulled directly from his lectures, his books, his interviews. And they're more disturbing than you might think. Let me take you back to October 1965. Feynman is asleep in his house in Altadena, California. The phone rings at some ungodly hour. It's a reporter. Professor Feynman, congratulations. You've won the Nobel Prize in physics. And you know what Feynman's first thought was? Not joy, not pride, not finally recognition for my work on quantum electrodynamics. His first thought was, oh God, now I'm going to have to deal with all this nonsense. He literally considered refusing it. Seriously considered it. Sat there trying to figure out how to say no to the most prestigious award in science. The only reason he accepted, and this is critical, was because he realized that refusing would create an even bigger circus than accepting. He'd be on the front page of every newspaper. Brilliant physicist rejects Nobel Prize. The interviews, the speculation, the endless questions about why. It would be worse than just taking the damn thing and trying to ignore it. So he accepted. But he hated every second of it. Now, you might be thinking, what's the problem? The Nobel Prize recognizes important work. It brings attention to science. It inspires young people. And sure, on the surface, that all sounds reasonable. But Feynman saw something deeper. Something that gets to the heart of what's wrong with how we think about science and discovery. Here's what he said, and I'm quoting directly from his own words. I don't see that it makes any point that someone in the Swedish Academy decides that this work is noble enough to receive a prize. I've already gotten the prize. The prize is the pleasure of finding the thing out, the kick in the discovery, the observation that other people use it. Those are the real things. Read that again. I've already gotten the prize. The real prize isn't the medal. It's not the money. It's not the ceremony in Stockholm. The real prize is the moment when you figure something out, when the universe reveals one of its secrets to you, when you solve a problem that's been bugging you for months or years. That's the reward. Everything else is just noise. But it gets deeper. Because Feynman understood something that most people miss, prizes fundamentally change how people think about science. They create this idea that science is a competition, that there are winners and losers, that the point is to get recognized, to get famous, to get the award. And that completely misses what science actually is. Science isn't a race to the prize. It's not about being first or being recognized or getting your name in the history books. Science is about understanding nature. It's about asking questions and finding answers. It's about the joy, the pure childlike joy of figuring out how things work. The moment you start doing science to win prizes, you've already lost the plot. You're not a scientist anymore. You're a prize hunter. And those are two completely different things. Feynman saw this happening around him. He watched as brilliant young physicists started choosing research problems not because they were interesting or important, but because they might lead to recognition. He saw people getting competitive, getting territorial, getting focused on being first instead of being right, and it disgusted him. Because that's not science, that's ego, that's ambition. That's the exact opposite of what science should be. Let me tell you what happened during the actual Nobel ceremony. Feynman had to get on a plane to Stockholm. He had to put on a tuxedo. He had to sit through endless formal dinners and speeches and handshaking with Swedish royalty. And the whole time he's thinking, this is absurd. This has nothing to do with physics. This has nothing to do with understanding nature. This is just theater, performance, spectacle. He described it later as one of the most uncomfortable experiences of his life. Not because people weren't nice, they were. Not because the ceremony wasn't beautiful, it was. But because the whole thing felt like a lie, like everyone was pretending that the medal and the ceremony and the recognition were what mattered. When the actual important thing, the science itself, the discovery, the understanding had already happened years ago in a small office at Caltech, when Feynman was scribbling diagrams on a blackboard. Those diagrams, by the way, the famous Feynman diagrams that helped him win the Nobel Prize, he didn't invent them to win awards. He invented them because he was frustrated. Quantum electrodynamics was this incredibly complicated mess of equations, and nobody could keep track of all the different ways particles could interact. So Feynman, being Feynman, said, screw it, I'm going to draw pictures. And those pictures, those simple, elegant diagrams, revolutionized how physicists think about particle interactions. That was the real achievement, not the prize, the work, the insight. The moment when Feynman realized you could represent quantum processes as little drawings with wiggly lines and straight lines and vertices. That moment of clarity, that flash of understanding, that was the reward. The Nobel Prize came 20 years later, like some kind of weird afterthought. But here's where it gets really interesting, because Feynman started to notice something troubling about how prizes affected the scientific community. He noticed that once someone won a Nobel Prize, people started treating their ideas differently. Their words carried more weight. Their opinions became more important. And this bothered Feynman enormously because scientific truth doesn't care about authority. It doesn't matter if a Nobel Prize winner says something or a first-year graduate student says something. What matters is it true? Can you demonstrate it? Can you test it? Does it match reality? But prizes create this hierarchy, this notion that some scientists are more important than others, and that's dangerous. Because good ideas can come from anywhere. Einstein was a patent clerk when he developed special relativity. Ramanujan was self-taught. Some of the most revolutionary insights in physics came from people who weren't famous, weren't recognized, weren't part of the establishment. The moment you start thinking this idea must be right because it came from a Nobel Prize winner, or this idea must be wrong because it came from a nobody, you've stopped doing science. You're doing something else. You're doing politics. You're doing tribalism. You're doing authority worship. Feynman experienced this firsthand. After winning the Nobel Prize, he noticed that people listened to him more. They paid more attention to his ideas. They were more likely to agree with him. And this terrified him because he knew that he was the same person he was before the prize. His ideas weren't any better or worse. His understanding of physics hadn't suddenly improved because some committee in Sweden gave him a medal. But people treated him differently. And he hated it. He tells this story in one of his lectures about a time after winning the Nobel Prize when he was asked to serve on a committee evaluating science textbooks for schools. And the other committee members kept deferring to him. Well, Professor Feynman, you won the Nobel Prize. What do you think? And he wanted to scream, my Nobel Prize was for quantum electrodynamics. That has nothing to do with whether this particular explanation of photosynthesis in the 7th grade textbook is any good. Judge the textbook on its merits, not on who's evaluating it. But that's not how prizes work. Prizes create celebrity. They create authority. They create this aura of specialness that has nothing to do with whether you're actually right about any given thing. And Feynman saw this as fundamentally corrupting to the scientific process. Now let's go even deeper. Because there's another problem with prizes that Feynman identified. They're always awarded to individuals or small groups. But science is actually a massive collaborative enterprise. Feynman won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1965, along with Julian Schwinger and Shinichiro Tominaga, for their work on quantum electrodynamics. But here's the thing. Dozens of other physicists contributed to that understanding. Freeman Dyson helped show that Feynman's and Schwinger's approaches were actually equivalent. Countless experimentalists did the painstaking work of testing the predictions. Other theorists laid the groundwork that made KED possible in the first place. But only 3 people got the prize. Only 3 names got immortalized. Only 3 people got the recognition. And this creates a false narrative about how science actually works. It makes it seem like science is done by lone geniuses having brilliant insights, when the reality is that science is done by communities of people building on each other's work, arguing, testing, refining, and gradually constructing better and better models of reality. Feynman understood this better than almost anyone. He knew that his work on KED didn't happen in a vacuum. He was building on quantum mechanics developed by people like Heisenberg and Schrödinger and Dirac. He was using mathematical techniques developed by mathematicians whose names nobody remembers. He was testing his ideas against experimental results gathered by experimentalists who never won any prizes. The whole edifice of modern physics is a collective achievement, but prizes pretend it's about individuals. And that's a lie. There's something else Feynman said that cuts to the heart of this. He was asked once why he thought he'd been successful in physics, and you know what he said? He said it was because he never cared about being successful. He cared about solving interesting problems. He cared about understanding nature. He said, I don't have to be good because I'm Feynman. I have to be good because I want to know the answer. Think about that. I don't have to be good because I'm Feynman. He's explicitly rejecting the idea that his identity, his reputation, his status, including his Nobel Prize, has anything to do with the quality of his work. The work has to stand on its own. It has to be judged on its own merits, not on who did it. But prizes do the exact opposite. They say, this work is important because the person who did it is important. They create this circular reasoning where recognition leads to more recognition, where fame feeds on itself, where the scientists who get prizes get more opportunities to do work that wins more prizes. And meanwhile, equally talented scientists who didn't happen to be in the right place at the right time, or who worked on problems that weren't fashionable, who just had bad luck, they get forgotten. Feynman saw this as deeply unfair. More than that, he saw it as bad for science. Because it creates these Matthew effects where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, where a few famous scientists suck up all the attention and resources while countless other talented people struggle for recognition and funding. And this isn't just unfair, it's inefficient. It means we're not making the best use of human talent. We're wasting brilliant minds because they don't have the right pedigree or didn't win the right prizes. Now, here's where Feynman's critique gets really radical, because he started to question not just prizes, but the whole apparatus of scientific recognition, the papers in prestigious journals, the invited talks at conferences, the endowed chairs at elite universities, all of it. He started to see the entire system as a kind of game that had very little to do with actually understanding nature. He tells this amazing story about a time he was invited to give a talk at some prestigious conference. And he's sitting there listening to other speakers, and he realizes nobody's actually saying anything new. They're all just presenting work that sounds impressive, that uses fancy mathematics, that makes them look smart. But nobody's actually trying to understand anything. They're just playing the academic game, trying to impress each other, trying to build their reputations. And Feynman thought, what am I doing here? This isn't science, this is performance art. So you know what he did? He got up and left, just walked out, didn't give his talk, went back to Caltech and worked on an actual problem he cared about. That's the thing about Feynman. He wasn't interested in playing the game. He was interested in physics. And he saw increasingly that the game was getting in the way of the physics, that people were more concerned with looking smart than with being right, more concerned with impressing their colleagues than with understanding nature. The Nobel Prize, in Feynman's view, was the ultimate symbol of this corruption. It was the game at its most pure. A bunch of people in Sweden deciding which physics was noble enough to deserve recognition based on criteria that often had more to do with politics and fashion than with actual importance. And once you won, you were supposed to be grateful. You were supposed to be honored. You were supposed to spend the rest of your career being Nobel laureate Richard Feynman instead of just Feynman, a guy who liked solving physics problems. He refused to play that role. After winning the Nobel Prize, he didn't put it on his CV. He didn't mention it in his lectures. When people introduced him as Nobel Prize winner Richard Feynman, he would sometimes interrupt and say, just call me Feynman. Because the prize wasn't him. It was just something that happened to him. It was noise. It was distraction. It was everything he thought was wrong with how society treats science. But here's the really tragic part. Despite Feynman's rejection of all this, despite his protest, despite his discomfort, despite him literally telling people that prizes were missing the point, the system didn't change. It got worse. Today, there's more emphasis on prizes than ever. More rankings of universities. More metrics for measuring scientific impact, more competition for grants and positions based on publication counts and citation scores and all these other proxies for quality that have very little to do with actual understanding. Feynman saw this coming. He saw that once you create metrics, people start gaming them. Once you create prizes, people start chasing them. Once you create hierarchies, people start fighting for position in them. And all of it pulls energy away from the actual work of science, from the actual joy of discovery, from the actual purpose of trying to understand how nature works. So when Feynman said the real prize is the pleasure of finding things out, he wasn't being modest. He wasn't being falsely humble. He was making a profound point about what science is and what it should be. Science is not a competition. It's not a status game. It's not about recognition or fame or prizes or getting your name in the history books. Science is about understanding. It's about asking questions and finding answers. It's about the moment when something clicks and you suddenly see how the world works in a way you didn't before. That moment, that flash of insight, that's the reward. That's what makes all the hard work worthwhile. Not some medal you get 20 years later from people who didn't do the work and don't really understand it. The medal is meaningless. The understanding is everything. And here's the thing that really gets me. Feynman was right. Look at his life. Look at what he accomplished. Did he do his best work before or after winning the Nobel Prize? Arguably before. He developed his most important ideas. The path integral formulation of quantum mechanics, the Feynman diagrams, the Parton model before winning the prize. After winning, he spent a lot of time dealing with the consequences of fame. Teaching, sure, he loved teaching. But also deflecting attention, avoiding publicity, trying to get back to just being a physicist instead of a celebrity physicist. The prize didn't help him do better science. If anything, it got in the way. And if that's true for Feynman, one of the most brilliant physicists of the 20th century, what does that say about the Nobel Prize? What does that say about our whole system of scientific recognition. Maybe Feynman was onto something. Maybe the real scandal isn't that the Nobel Prize is a scam. He never said that. But maybe the real scandal is that we've built this entire apparatus of prizes and prestige and recognition that fundamentally misunderstands what science is about. That celebrates the wrong things. That creates perverse incentives. That distorts how science is done and who gets to do it. Feynman spent his whole life trying to point this out, not with grand pronouncements or manifestos, but just by being himself, by refusing to play the game, by insisting that the work matters more than the recognition, by choosing interesting problems over prestigious problems, by valuing understanding over awards. And you know what? He was happier for it. He genuinely loved physics. Not because it brought him fame, he hated the fame. Not because it brought him prizes, he was uncomfortable with the prizes. But because figuring out how nature works is genuinely wonderful. It's thrilling. It's joyful. It's its own reward. That's what we've lost sight of. We've forgotten that the point of science is the science itself, not the prizes, not the recognition, not the prestige, just the pure pleasure of finding things out. So the next time you hear about someone winning the Nobel Prize or any other prize in science, remember Feynman. Remember that the real prize happened years earlier, in some quiet moment when a scientist figured something out, when the universe revealed one of its secrets, when understanding replaced confusion. That's the moment worth celebrating. Everything else is just ceremony, just noise. Just people playing a game that has very little to do with what actually matters. Feynman understood this. He lived it. And maybe, just maybe, we should listen to him.